Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the Center Ballroom of the UMC. We're here for the Conference of World Affairs, number 3107, the Trump Presidency. Are we tired of winning yet? With us, we have three great panelists. In alphabetical order by last name, I'll introduce them. First, Michael Frank. Mike comes to us from Washington, D.C., where he's a Hoover Institution's Director of D.C. Programs. Prior to that, he has a long history working both in legislative and executive branches in D.C. and has a long tenure as the Vice President of Government Relations for the Heritage Foundation. Second on the end, we have Robert George. Robert lives in Manhattan and is a member of the New York Daily News's editorial board. Rumor has it that he got his first real taste of presidential politics in 1988 when he tried to volunteer at both the Republican and the Democratic National Conventions. Only one of them let him in. And finally,
guess which
next
one?
to me is...
Which one?
Yeah, you guys figure out which one.
Right.
Finally, next to me is John Harrison Nichols. John is from Madison, Wisconsin. He is the Washington correspondent for The Nation. He's written extensively on media and politics and is a regular TV and radio guest on shows hosted by the likes of Ed Schultz, Chris Hayes, and Tom Hartman. Contrary to your program, I'm not Beverly Silva. I'm Paul Weissman, former House Majority Leader and current Boulder County Treasurer. I got my first taste in presidential politics when I dropped out of CU in 1983 to travel the country with Gary Hart and have worked presidential politics since, the last being with Martin O'Malley's presidential campaign. With that, let's go ahead and get started with our panel. Mike, if you want to kick it off, that'd be great.
Sure. Hello, everybody. It's nice to be back and see so many familiar faces. Some of you have seen a couple times already, but I did start slow this week on panels. I'm picking up steam today and tomorrow. So big picture way that I think about this stuff is I think of two concentric circles that overlap in the proverbial Venn diagram, and we can debate how much that overlap is, but one of the circles would be Trump, and one of the circles would be more traditional right-of-center policy ideas and legislative initiatives and so on. And to me, the areas where I find myself agreeing with things that President Trump has done are the parts where there's that overlap. And in areas like his nominations to the courts, like it, his policies on the regulatory side, I like those. The tax bill, I give it maybe a 6 out of 10 on that. I think there's some good elements of it and some missed opportunities. On things like immigration, I really dislike the rhetoric. I can see a lot of the policies going in the wrong direction if they can come to fruition. I see immigration, and we can talk about it more. In fact, we have a panel on immigration this afternoon on this. But I see immigration as a great benefit for this country that is sort of like a, when you think about the 40% of the Fortune 500 companies are founded by immigrants or the children of immigrants, that's kind of a good marker that America benefits writ large from immigration. On trade, I think of all the things he's said rhetorically that I find abhorrent, it would be on his criticism of NAFTA, because Mexico and then Canada are 1 and 2 are trading partners, and there's all kinds of reasons why that agreement has, for over 20 years, been a wonderful economic advantage to the United States and to our partner countries in Canada and Mexico. So to the extent that he's thinking seriously and has advisors who want to denigrate and get rid of NAFTA, I think that is about the worst thing one could do from an economic standpoint, even more so than the relations with China on trade and the relations getting out of the TPP, which I disagree with. But relatively speaking, when you look at how much of our trade is conducted with Canada and Mexico, it dwarfs almost everywhere else in the world. So that's, to me, is a real big one. And we can talk about other issues, but basically there's some things I think he's done well. I think the tax bill, for example, is about as good as one could get out of this Congress. It would have been probably better if there had been more engagement and bipartisan discussions, but that kind of ended early in the process with a list of demands that were not just a started opening negotiating ploy, but they were actually hard and fast, and that took the Democratic senators, at least, out of the negotiating side of things. And so they ended up with one of these bills that was purely one party voting for it at the end of the day. And that's a trend we've had in recent years that I find frustrating. It happened on the Affordable Care Act. It happened on some of the previous big legislative items as well in maybe the last 10 or so years. And that's not good. We used to do big bills in a bipartisan way. Rhetorically, my biggest complaint perhaps is just one element of a good leader is to the evangelical side of being able to make a case for one's ideas and make a case in a way that people who are on the fence can hear it and say, wow, that's a compelling argument. I kind of like that. I've changed my way of seeing the issue, and you can bring people into your tent. Unfortunately, I think Trump is hardwired to want to do the opposite on a daily basis, and I think that's a real failure of his presidency. I'll tell you one little anecdote on that. My mother, who was an immigrant and who is now 101 years and 4 months old, is in hope I got those genes right. She's in a nursing home near Catholic University, and the women mostly who work there on the nursing side are from Ghana and Ethiopia and Sierra Leone and one or two other countries. And there's one lone male, and he's this wonderful, nice guy from South Korea. And one time I had a chat when they were all sitting around having lunch with them, and one of them asked me sheepishly, what do you think of Donald Trump? And I kind of rolled my eyes and started making these kind of, complaints, but not talking policy so much as just broad, attitudinal feelings about him. And they all kind of nodded, and one of them said, when we came here, we were looking for someone, and it didn't say it exactly in these words, but for someone who was presidential, someone we could look up to, And I think if there's any place where it's unforgivable that he's fallen short, it would be in the inability to broaden the base of people who actually see the world in a way that's compatible with the policies that are being advanced in the administration. He's not even trying to do that. And I think that's, I guess I would lay, of all the things that I find disconcerting, that is the big one. And of course, from your perspective, you probably like that, right? Because it's not like he's growing the base anywhere, right? So anyway, maybe I'll stop at that point. But those are the broad sense. And what I do find in a lot of conversations with friends who are progressives, and I'm dating one, and Robert knows her, and he can say, capital P and exclamation point at the end, and font and bold and italics and all that kind of stuff.
Lovely woman.
Yeah, She is. She was supposed to come here, but she couldn't for work reasons. But there's this, real wild passion that about Trump in the negative side that ends up kind of bleeding into the sense that anything he's for, even if it's something I've been in favor of for 30, 40 years, is now kind of disreputable, and you have to abandon those ideas, period. Like there's no understanding that we might be in that overlapping part of those two circles of the Venn diagram I described. And I kind of hope that people can start to disaggregate those kind of situations where you're doing kind of mainstream right-of-center policymaking, and he happens to have people in place in the agencies advancing those things and works with allies on Capitol Hill on bills that when I was up there we were passing with great regularity to see die in the Senate, that you don't kind of confuse that with Donald Trump, the president, and the vitriol with which you might hold him in, okay? So that's my one kind of emotional plea here today, all right? And I'll turn it over to, who's next? John?
Let's go ahead, John.
All right. Thank you to a very wise and good man. Want some water? Yeah, I'll take it, man. I believe that Michael has confirmed his state of solid personal adjustment. Because, of course, we are supposed to date people that are smarter than us.
I've always been the dumbest guy in the room, so I continue to do that in my relationships, too.
You're certainly not the dumbest in the room, but I believe that your progressive partner has the potential to lead you to the promised land.
She calls me a partner, and that's one of your words, isn't it, John?
It is one of our words. We're going to taking it all the way.
She's going to make him an ally at any point now.
Yeah. Ooh. As Eugene Victor Debs said, I would not lead you into the promised land because if I could, someone else might lead you out. And I always like to start with a quote from Debs. I think it sets things in the proper parameters here. I'm also incredibly excited to be sitting on a stage with a true optimist. Somebody who went around the country campaigning for Martin O'Malley is unquestionably an optimist. And I noticed that Mr. O'Malley was
O'Malley would have won.
Yeah. I noticed that O'Malley he was in New Hampshire last week. So perhaps you won't see this guy next year on the panel. So let's talk about this a little bit. You know what the biggest challenge we have? I thought about this a lot. And I've got this great speech on all the vulnerabilities that Trump shows. And I probably could have boiled it down. But I thought I'd actually try and address the topic. And so I thought about this a lot, this notion of winning, right? And it strikes me that the biggest problem we've got right now in America is that we don't have a shared definition of winning. And we certainly don't have a shared definition of victory. We have radically different opinions on what a win is. And, we talk about ourselves as being siloed. And, in our world where we talk to people like us, get our information from people like us. But this is much more severe than that. This gets us to the point of, literally, I think there's a tremendous number of people who aren't sure what a victory would be, perhaps on both sides. And to the extent that they can define it, it is that the other guys lose, right? And that is disastrous, in my opinion, for both political parties. It is extremely dangerous for the Democratic Party, because if the Democratic Party's entire message in this era is a victory will be getting rid of Trump, which is an easy thing to say and not an unappealing notion. But if that's the end of it, I can promise you that a better-looking, more reserved, more responsible person, stylistically, who advances exactly the agenda that Trump advances, could fit into that void, right? And so we do want to define the fight and what it's about, and we want to define victory more broadly than simply an election result. And I think that Paul Ryan did that this morning because he is an ambitious man with many goals, and he has not begun to achieve his agenda by any measure. And yet this morning he chose to abandon his re-election campaign and leave the Congress of the United States because it was his view. He won't say it in so many words. You always claim a victory in a moment like this. But it was, I think, his view that the likelihood of getting to the sane conservative position that he wanted to achieve is just unrealistic. It's beyond the realm of possibility, probably because of coming election results, but also because of the people he's surrounded by. And I will take it from Paul Ryan that we're not winning. No matter what our measure is as a country, where we're at right now is not a healthy place because we don't have healthy discussion, we don't begin to have a healthy debate. I define winning as the achievement of a just and humane society in which our elections are participated in at the highest levels and in which our government is a reflection of the popular will. Now, be careful. The popular will can get ugly sometimes. But when you have a president who lost the popular vote by 3 million votes, and when it's the second time that that's happened in 16 years, I think at a structural level, we have fundamental problems. And we ought to recognize that as much as we get excited about Donald Trump, one way or the other, what we ought to recognize is we have structures in our politics that don't begin to get us to that fair and equitable and just place or that reflection of the popular will. And we blame Donald Trump all we want. What we ought to do is start looking at the structural flaws in our system that make it impossible at times to even win and take office. Hillary Clinton, by the measures of most countries around the world, won, but she didn't take office. There have been election cycles recently where Democrats won the most votes for seats in Congress and the U.S. Senate, but they didn't get control. We've had that at the legislative levels in states. So we have structural problems in this country that take us away even from the baseline political measure of winning. But let me go to something that I think is the bigger challenge of our moment. I defer to Michael on about the last third of everything he said. And no, I think but he's saying, like this guy, how he communicates, what he's doing to our society, all of these things. But I would take it a step deeper. I think Donald Trump and his opponents, frequently in this moment, are so wrapped up in a discussion of the moment that they prevent us from even getting near the possibility of winning anything akin to what I would like to see in the long term. And that is because I believe that Donald Trump's presidency will, at best, be I like accountability moments, so maybe it won't be 4, but let's imagine a 4-year period where we didn't begin to address fundamental challenges in this country, and we actually went in the wrong direction. And I'll put this up front, and then we'll discuss a lot of other specific issues as we go along. But this is something I say to virtually every group. We're 30 years into a process of globalization that is changing everything about how we relate to the rest of the world and how we relate to people in our communities. Globalization is not just some economic concept. It's the food we eat, the languages we speak, the understandings that we have. We know more about the world now than at any point in history. And we really do interact in fundamental ways. But what that means is that our native experience, our experience in this specific place, is radically different than it was 20 or 30 years ago for all of us. And it has economic consequences. It has political consequences. It has social consequences. We're 20 years into a digital revolution that is changing everything about how we communicate. We communicate so differently from what we did in the past that television, radio, newspapers are in crisis. The Denver Post is in total crisis because the revenue models don't work, structures don't work. I mean, things are blowing apart because we are all living in our phone. How many of you are grandparents? Good chunk. How many of you have seen your grandchild's face without this in between? A couple of you, and I love you back there. We're in Boulder, so I know there's some of that. I've tried hard, man. It's a hard fight. But here's the bottom line. It's literally, when I ask that question, because that's how big a change it's been, right? That we now have something in between us. I do a lot of panels on tech progress, and I was at one in Europe. A couple of years ago, I was interviewing the top expert in the world on artificial intelligence. He said, for years we were thinking that people can't keep up with the computers and the robots. We're going to have to genetically alter people. We're going to have to put a chip in them, or we're going to have to think, really, these radical ideas. And then he said a couple of years ago, we figured out we won't have to do that because people voluntarily chose to extend their arms and put a computer on the end of their hand. And the fact is, but that's big. It's funny, but it's real, right? And then the final one is an automation revolution that will change everything about how we work and how we organize our lives. And that change will be more radical than globalization and digital. I promise you. And the end result is all of this creates a lot of hope, a lot of possibility, but also an immense amount of tension, fear, and uncertainty. Donald Trump's answer to that tension, fear, and uncertainty wasn't let's win the future. Donald Trump's answer was make America great again, and the operative word was again, i.e. going backward. And so far from winning, we are in a moment where the President of the United States is saying that the future is to go backward. The future is to not try and harness the possibilities of what comes, but to try and rekindle something that was. That is a horrible, dangerous abandonment of our possibility as a country. It is also an invitation to scapegoating, fear-mongering, and blaming the other. And the fact of the matter is, if you don't look to the future, and if you don't start to address these challenges, the primary challenge of the future being one of distribution, how do we take all of our progress and make sure everyone can share in it? If we don't address that, then the only answer that's going to come is going to be, I don't like the immigrant, I don't like the refugee, we might have to have a war, we might have to do some other action that by its nature will divide destroy, and weaken not just America, but potentially the world. This morning, Donald Trump was tweeting about shiny missiles, right? This is absurd. It is wrong. We are not winning. We are actually at odds with winning as a country. We are at odds with the future because our president wants to go backward when we desperately, desperately need to explore what comes next and make it work for all of us. Thank you.
Great, Robert.
I had a handful of kind of prepared ideas that I was going to present for this panel, but partly because of the insightful genius of my colleagues here, and partly though because of the news of the day, which both of them have also referenced, and also partly because of how our moderator. Partly, how are we doing? Great.
Now, if I may interrupt, now we are winning.
Usually, the last thing I need to be told is to project my voice, so I guess that's why I was acting like that. I'm not going to kind of dismiss some of the comments I was going to make before, for a couple of reasons. First of all, the gentleman to my immediate right, Michael Frank, is the reason why I am here. Is the reason why I've been coming off and on to CWA for the last 10 years or so. So you can blame him if you want. And one of the reasons why, because Mike, we met probably close to 20, 25 years or so. And as I think many of Boulderites who've met him, I think regardless of your personal political beliefs, I think many of you think that if there were more conservatives like Michael Frank, there would be more conservatives everywhere. There'd be more conservatives even in Boulder. Well, maybe that's going a little bit too far. But the other point is, as our moderator made a joke, and it wasn't a joke. It was a fact that in 1988 I did tried and attempted a way to try and get to both political parties' conventions, and the Republicans figured out a way to let me in, and the Democrats didn't. Spoiler alert: the person who actually said, "Oh, sorry, we couldn't quite make it," was Kathleen Kennedy Townsend. So another reason to blame a Kennedy. But the point is, the Republicans opened the door for me, and I've found it an interesting experience being there, and I found a vibe that I was able to engage with. And that's true, even though I am an immigrant. I'm obviously African American, and it was a time where I felt that the Republican Party was welcoming, was open on the issues of immigration. Sure, there's going to be whole debates about things like welfare reform and affirmative action and things like that, and those are contentious. Policies. We're not all going to have an agreement, and we're going to say, "Oh, you're being racist," or "You're being this and that." But there was still kind of common ground where you could still have kind of have strong kind of conversations. The news of the day, the news of the morning, obviously was that Paul Ryan is going to step down as Speaker, or that is to say, he's not going to run for Congress again. 2 years ago, June 2016, I wrote a column in my paper, the Daily News. It was an open letter to Paul Ryan, and if you'll give you a moment here, I'm going to read the first couple of paragraphs from that. On Tuesday, you stood up and said what thousands, perhaps millions of Republicans have been wanting to hear since Donald Trump burst on the 2016 political scene 51 weeks ago at that time, riding a downward escalator. parentheses, appropriately enough, given what he was about to do to the Republican Party, close quote, close parentheses. But you didn't go far enough. Quote, the textbook definition of racism, unquote, is what you called Trump's unfounded, unprecedented attack on federal judge Gonzalo Curiel, the Mexican-American jurist whose only, quote, crime, unquote, has been making unfavorable rulings in the Trump University lawsuits. For days, he ignored advice to back down from his offensive and strategically foolish assault. Instead, he doubled down and directed his surrogates to continue assailing the judge. Finally, Tuesday, he released a half-started statement. Anyway, so Paul Ryan, at that point, called that the textbook definition of racism, and he was correct in that. But he like a number of other Republicans, were not able to go farther than that. We're not able to say, well, as Speaker, I cannot support the candidate of our party who engages in the textbook definition of racism. And the point I went on in this column to make is that Paul Ryan's mentor in politics, Jack Kemp, would have been appalled at that moral cowardice. And Ryan's decision to go along, get along. Now, it's understandable that, as a speaker, he is a leader of the party, and it is very difficult for a leader of the party to not go along with the party's nominee, to not support the party's nominee. But if the party that you are a leader of is ostensibly speaking the party of Lincoln, are you willing then to completely turn that 150-year legacy on the candidate of the moment? Ryan made his choice, and in making that choice, he, in a sense, gave cover to many other Republicans, saying, "Well, Ryan's okay with him. I can make my peace with him." And Ryan maybe he was naive at the time and thought, well, like many Republicans, he didn't think necessarily think that Trump was going to get elected. So, but even if he did, he said, well, we in Congress will be able to kind of, control some of his more tribalistic, animalistic sensibilities. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. And in fact, those who had eyes to see could have realized that would not have happened. No offense to the people in this room, but 70-year-olds don't change their minds overnight. I'm sorry, it just doesn't happen. I'm living with my mother now. I'm seeing that for myself. It just doesn't. It just doesn't happen. The point being, Ryan had a moment to actually stand up and denounce that statement. I mean, excuse me. He denounced the statement. He had an opportunity to denounce the man, and he opted not to. And so we have now see the results of that action. As Mike said, there are a number of decisions that Trump has made that the typical Republican president would have made. Like the tax cuts would have gotten through under just about any other. It may be a little bit different, but they would have gotten through under just about any other Republican president. So say the appointments would have been more or less the same. Regulations on doing basically the same. Neil Gorsuch would have still been on. Neil Gorsuch would have still been on the Supreme Court. But we would not necessarily, we would not with a Jeb Bush, a Marco Rubio, even a Scott Walker, we would not have had this debasement of our political speech. We would not have the debasement of a Republican Party where those who do stand up to the president get pushed out and, in a sense, forced into retirement, like a Jeff Flake, like a Bob Corker. We would not have a situation where Republicans are trying to defend or figure out a way not to defend the statements of a president who calls places shithole countries and things like that. John talked about the fact that the country isn't winning. The Republican Party, unfortunately, is not winning with Donald Trump as president of the United States until any of those Republicans decide to actually stand up and challenge him forcefully on a regular basis, saying it is inappropriate to make these statements about other politicians within and without outside of the party, within his own administration. There's this idea of, well, this is not normal and that's not normal. No, none of this is normal, and the Republican Party will not wake up until we have a reckoning in November, and it depends on what level that reckoning is. If they lose the House, many of them will try and figure out a way to say, oh well, we'll be able to muddle through. We still have the Senate, and the Senate is in control of appointments. And if there's a resignation of the Supreme Court, we'll try and push that through. They'll try and rationalize it. However, if the so-called blue wave is so strong enough that it even flips the Senate, maybe then they'll wake up. But at that point, it'll largely be too late, because Donald Trump is going to be around at least through 2020. Even if Democrats came in and impeached him, there's no way that the Senate is going to remove him. And by the time 2020 rolls around, it may be too late for the Republican Party to recover the soul that it's lost. Thank you.
I'm a little nervous to open it up for dialogue amongst the panelists, because one has an unfair advantage with a double shot of espresso over here. But if there's anything you gentlemen want to ask each other or bounce off each other, let's just go to questions. And gentlemen, feel free, if there's a question that comes in, if you want to go back and forth, if you want to arm wrestle or whatever you want to do over the thing, we'll do that. We'll start with a student question. Well, first of all, before we go questions, we are getting a bunch in. You'll notice that there are people walking around doing it the note card way. If you'd like to also go on the app, they've hooked me up with this thing that I'm trying to figure out how to use to select the questions off of there as well. So you can either go to the app to submit a question or do it the old-fashioned way with note cards. I can actually do them either way. And if you are a student, please indicate that. Being on the University of Colorado, students actually trump and have priority. So we'll start with the student question. It's actually a pretty simple one. Is our democracy dying?
Well, just to be clear, in terms of definitions, our republic is not dying. I mean, we're a constitutional republic, and it's important to make that distinction. No, I don't believe it is. I think all you have to do is look around at what's been happening in various special elections around the country. And not just in terms of special elections. There's a fair amount of controversy on how the young people from Florida are engaging in politics. But the fact that they are engaging in politics, I think, is a positive development, and that they're energizing some of their older peers. So I think there are definite challenges, as John put it, maybe structural challenges, but I don't think either the democracy or the republic is dying.
I'll say something quick. The last 40 plus years, if you think about House and Senate and presidency, you have something like, I think it's 9 different combinations. You have 2 parties who could control which. Sometimes one party controls both chambers of Congress and the other party controls the White House. Sometimes one party controls all 3, and the other combinations. We've had every single one of those combinations since about 1975 or so. And a lot of political scientists would see that as evidence of a vibrant democracy. It could be polarization, but there is a swinging back and forth. The other part about that, which may explain some of the rhetoric and the intensity, is that the margins of majority since 1994 in the House and the Senate have, by any historical standard, been very, very narrow, except with that one period, 2009 and 10, when the Democrats had 60, actually 2009 until Senator Kennedy passed away, had 60 seats in the Senate. But for that one period, which, by the way, yielded a very bountiful legislative set of wins for the majority party, but for that, you've had a lot of years where the Senate has been under 55 majority votes, meaning that the minority, under the traditions of the Senate, could stop many, many things or slow other things down. And the House margins, which during the 40-year period when the Democrats had uninterrupted control, were ordinarily, many times in the 250 to 270 range, and you need 218 for a simple majority. Plus, you had some members of the other party that would swing to the Democratic side on a lot of votes. So meaning that a lot of those big votes, there wasn't as much acrimony and screaming and ranting and raving, because it was the outcome was always predetermined because of the high margins of one party. And I could have been a good whip for the Democrats during those years, right? You could bleed 30, 40 votes and still win easily. And so I think those are both signs of healthy democracies. And one of the natural, I guess, manifestations of that is the acrimony and the screaming that we get, magnified by modern media. And I think it's healthy. The one thing I would point out that is unhealthy, I think, is that we have a somewhat different democracy. We have the separation of powers in very, I think, sophisticated ways that yield protections of our liberty at the end of the day. And to the extent that those break down, I think we have trouble. I'll give you an example. I think that as between Article 1, 2, and 3 branches of government, Congress, Article 1, is suffering relative to Article 2, the executive branch. And there's a lot of ways you can go into that and talk about it. But part of it is that Congress is unilaterally disarmed in terms of the tools it makes available to itself, really since the 94 Republican takeover. And I'll give you one statistical example or two. I had to give a presentation on this to some new members of Congress about a year ago. And when I looked it up in the Congressional Research Service studies, I was really surprised. So in 1980, there were just short of 2,000 professional committee staff in the House. I didn't do the Senate, but I did the House. In 2016, 36 years later, there were under 1,200. So you had a 40% drop in the number of the, I'd like to call them the intellectual Jedi warrior class of staff who really know policy areas, who really have a lot of responsibility for rubber hitting the road and getting bills drafted, getting amendments drafted, making sure they're drafted properly, that kind of stuff. Preparing for hearings, managing hearings and all that. A 40% drop, which I think takes away a lot of their ability as a co-equal, and that's an important word, co-equal branch of government, to do oversight, to monitor what's going on in the executive branch. Court rulings, in turn, have also enhanced the power of the executive branch agencies. Witness the Chevron doctrine, which requires courts to defer to the expert judgment of executive branch agencies unless their actions are arbitrary and capricious, which means almost anything goes. And courts are instructed by the Supreme Court pretty much to defer routinely to the judgment calls of the agencies. And that's an imbalance that I think needs to be addressed. So I think when these balances get out of whack, bad things tend to happen. And I think we're in that territory in general right now. But the elections, as I described, I think is a general healthy sign, too.
The history of the American experiment is an aspiration toward democracy. We were founded in original sin. We allowed slavery. We disempowered women. We disempowered indentured workers. We disempowered religious dissidents or those who didn't believe in a so-called mainstream and proper way. And so as a result, we have fought a 240-some-year battle to make real a promise of democracy. And we really got a long way down the road. There's no question. By the 1970s, we had tremendous progress, mostly through constitutional amendments, by the way. We actually had to alter the document to say that African American men should be allowed to vote, to say that women should be allowed to vote, to say that people 18 to 21 should be allowed to vote, to say that those who did not have the money to pay to vote, because we had a poll tax, should be allowed to vote. I mean, these are fundamental shifts. This is the great story of America. It is greater than any president. It is greater than any Congress, because it is a revolutionary story that at every turn came from the people, not from their leaders, not from politicians, not from a media system that so often underinforms us or misinforms us. And so it's the most beautiful thing. It's the most beautiful of all of our promises. And it is, at the very least today, dysfunctional. It is unquestionably threatened. And we should not be casual about the moment in which we find ourselves. When you live in a country where a wealthy person can literally, out of their wealth, shout down both candidates in a race and decide what the issue will be. When we live in a country where wealth and power has the ability to narrow our debate to such an extent and to dumb it down to such an extent that we might be debating cuts to food stamps so we can fund increases in military spending, which is against the deep moral values of any conservative liberal. It's an inhumane and irresponsible circumstance, and it doesn't come from us. Our political discourse is defined by wealth and power, and by a deference to wealth and power on the part of our politicians, our media, and frankly the people who should be setting this thing straight. So yeah, it's terribly threatened. It's a mess. We have gerrymandering. We have an electoral college. We have all sorts of other structural flaws. We have immense money in politics, which, yes, sometimes somebody who doesn't have the most money wins, but it's because they're a TV show celebrity, not because they're somebody who came up from the grassroots. And so the system's a mess. It's not working. We should be furious about it. But is democracy dying? No, it's not. Because the day after Donald Trump had the most ridiculous and lame and empty inauguration, hardly anybody showed up, and those who did show up had to listen to somebody talking about, like scorched earth of the future. After he had this embarrassing attempt at a transition in power, the next day, American cities across this country and Washington, D.C. itself was filled with women wearing pink hats. And the fact of the matter is, I felt a little bit down on inaugural day. I felt really happy on January 21st, and I felt even happier when that poor president had to send the miserable Sean Spicer out to try and lie about it. Because at the end of the day, if they have to lie to you about your numbers, if they have to tell you that you're not seeing what you're seeing, brothers and sisters, we're here to define the word winning. That is winning. And I'll say this very quickly as well, as we've had reference to the role that young people are playing. It's this amazing thing. 16-year-olds are proving how horrifically incompetent so much of our political class is in, because Marco Rubio's been treated as a serious human being up to this point until he was standing there with a 17-year-old who shredded him, literally shredded him. And so as long as that can happen, as long as that kid can shred a senator, as long as the women can come out, and as long as we can have a moment like that beautiful, exquisite moment when Donald Trump tried to do the refugee ban, the Muslim ban, whatever attempt he had to call it, that beautiful moment Saturday night when people rushed to airports across this country to put their bodies in the way of injustice, to say, we are a nation of immigrants and we are not going to stand here and tell people they can't come because of their religious faith or because of the country they came from. And there were these beautiful pictures of Jews who came from shul with their children and stood with Muslims, Jewish and Muslim children, holding hands and standing in the way of a government that would deny a welcome to Muslims in this case, but to Jews in the past. The fact of the matter is, we have a beautiful, wonderful democracy in this country. And it's working hard to realize its full promise.
Just checking.
No, I think I went first. Whatever the next
You
question
can go
is.
again if you want, although we can move on. You know, I'm going to actually not go to the next question, but skip because John brought it up. There's a number of questions we have here about things that he brought up in gerrymandering, in electoral college, in money in politics, and how they relate. If anybody wants to stretch into that for a little bit, we certainly can. We have a number of questions.
The electoral college, the remedy, I suppose, for that is to get rid of, the small state, large state compromises that were made at the founding when the Constitution was first written. Do you want to do the same for the Senate? Do you want? It seems to me at that point, the logical solution is to have a unicameral parliament, right, and go the European route, and basically that requires a constitutional convention. And I'm wondering, maybe that's the channel of energy. You need to rally yourselves around an Article 5 convention and open up the whole Constitution to a whole lot of changes. You can eliminate the Second Amendment. You can do a lot of things, right? But short of that, the solution to me is go into Brooklyn, get one of your billionaires to pay a lot of Brooklynites to move to Nebraska, and change the politics geographically. Right now, that's one of the problems is, you walk into a building in Brooklyn that has 200 people in it, and you get about an 85% for one party and 5% for the socialists, and maybe a Republican or two in the mix, right? They should be spread out. That's kind of the way you can do it short of having a constitutional convention.
And on the gerrymandering has been around almost as long as the Constitution has been around, in one form or another. One of the and I'm drawing a blank on his name now, but it was one of the master gerrymanders. Well, I was thinking
California.
the California.
Yeah.
Phil Burton. Fixed races, to put it politely, in California for years. One of the reasons why the Republican majority is strong right now is the wave of 2010. I mean, that was perfect timing for Republicans, because they not only did they sweep the House, they had like 600 or 700 pickups of legislative seats, and that enabled them to draw district lines as they wished. And if the Democrats had succeeded, they would have done precisely the same thing. So obviously the Supreme Court is now going to be determining if pure political gerrymandering is constitutional. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Prior to that, we've been looking at it as to whether gerrymandering that takes into too much account race, whether that should be unconstitutional. That seems to be an easier kind of a decision. Whether just purely on partisan grounds, that's a harder call. But the key thing is, if one way to ungerrymander some of the districts is for progressives to be successful in 2018, 2020, and see what happens when they get a chance to draw the lines themselves.
Just to build off one point Robert made, don't forget the 2010 election occurred at the very, very end of a 10-year cycle. So they were working off lines that had been drawn 10 years earlier, in many cases by majorities of the other party, yet things changed enough so that a lot of seats that went one way in the early 2000s went the other way in 2010. And you can see that happening even now. You have Pennsylvania 18, which was a gerrymandered seat according to the court, right? When what number of points for the Democrat had been an 18-point Trump district. So things change. That's one of the vibrancies of our democracy.
things do change. It is one of the vibrancies of our democracy. And the fact is that I don't think we need a constitutional convention to address fundamental failures at the founding of the American experiment. Let's be very blunt about this. We talk about the Senate, okay. The founding of the American experiment, the Senate was chosen in back rooms by legislators, right? And it became such a crisis of corruption that in 1913, we decided that maybe we would have an elected U.S. Senate because we didn't want it chosen in back rooms by corrupt legislators. And so we have addressed fundamental flaws along the way many, many times, including a number of amendments that address the original sin of the American experiment, which was permission of human bondage. And so we should be very, very comfortable with the notion that we can do changes in this country that make democracy work better. And look, I'm amazed by the discussion, not these guys who I love and who are very good, but I actually hear people who will say, well, gerrymandering, why should we care about it, really, because one side does it, the other side does it. I 100% agree. They're both horrible. When they do it, it's wrong. When you draw districts that are non-competitive so that you get to choose your voters and the voters are left on the sideline, when you have whole states in this country where 40% of the people are disenfranchised as regards Congress because their votes are just tossed off, that's a fundamental flaw. And the reason the Supreme Court is addressing it today is because it has become a crisis in America. And that crisis is so severe because we have weaponized gerrymandering. It is now a world of computers and structural interventions by billionaires. It's not a couple of politicians sitting on the back of an envelope drawing districts because they think this neighborhood's better for them than that. No, this is people from outside of states coming in with tens of millions of dollars to warp national politics by drawing the voters out of the process. So we should be very, very comfortable talking about an amendment to the Constitution of the United States that gets rid of the Electoral College because it is anti-democratic. We should be very, very comfortable talking about an amendment to the Constitution of the United States that says we must militate against gerrymandering. We may not always be able to avoid it, but we can deal with it. And finally, we should be comfortable with an amendment to the Constitution of the United States that says corporations are not people, money is not speech, and we have a right to organize elections in which our votes matter more than their dollars.
Here's one quick fun fact about gerrymandering. A fun fact about gerrymandering. Yes, I know it sounds.
Actually, there's a lot of them.
There's a lot. There are a lot of them. One of them is it's not the sole reason, but one contributing factor to the success of Republicans in 1994 in taking the House is because in a number of southern states, the Republican National Committee and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund worked together to draw district lines in the South to create black majority districts. That was to send more African Americans to Congress. But to do that, they packed African Americans in these districts. That yes, it did send more African Americans to Congress, but it also made the neighboring districts more white, which then turned around and sent more white conservative Republicans to Congress. So you often have to be careful of what you wish for.
Another just general point about gerrymandering is that in the 80s and into the 90s, there was a sense that the proper reform to remedy these inkblot-looking districts was districts that followed historical lines of rivers, county lines, that kind of thing. They were more compact. The shape of the district would be more likely to resemble a circle, a square, a rectangle, that sort of thing. Well, if you do that today, I don't think you solve your political problem that you're looking at. If you want to fix, if you want to create, more parity, and you have these urban areas that are, 75, 85% one party, you're going to have to draw those really meandering, crazy lines that require, supercomputers to design and reach out from inner city blocks and neighborhoods into suburban and exurban areas to pick up some kind of a balanced constituency. So one of the problems you've run into, I think, in general, is that the old remedy is now would now create these districts that would be 75, 85% one party because of the nature of how people are settled and sorted, especially in the cities and the close-in suburbs.
My only last, and it's very quick, my only thing is I'd like the supercomputers to be paid for by the people or by in the public interest rather than billionaires who don't live in those states, who want to draw lines that will elect people to Congress and will elect legislators that will enact laws that favor those billionaires over the people who live in those states.
Let's hop back to President Trump and winning with the student question. This one was directed to Mr. Nichols specifically, although anybody can answer. The student asked, John, I've seen some of your interviews for your book, and your mention over and over about how the wall won't work. My question is, with so many examples where walls do work, Israel put up a terrific, put up a fence that decreased illegal immigration by 85%. Why do you think the wall will not work with so many proven examples where it does?
I very much respect the question, but I think they might have been watching another John Nichols. Is that I'm talking? I haven't. My book was about.
There's two of you?
Oh yeah, there's the guy who writes the. No, there's the guy who writes the Milagro Beanfield War. Man, he's fantastic. And but yeah, I'm trying. But my book was about Trump's cabinet, so I didn't actually spend a lot of time talking about the wall. However, I'm willing to accept the notion that walls don't work. And my gut instinct is telling me that the news out of Israel and Palestine at this point suggests that there are some problems. And also, look, here's a fundamental reality of this thing. Donald Trump talked about a wall because as a political tactic. It was a tool that he used to dominate our newscasts and our discussion. It was incredibly successful. It helped to frame a debate. He became president of the United States, right? This is such a central thing. If you said, well, Donald Trump, what do I think about? Billionaire, wall, right? Now, of course, billionaire porn star wall. But the bottom line is that he, he played this thing out. And then, since he's been president of the United States, how ambitious has he been about that wall, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is, it's kind of like, yeah, well, it might, it could just be like a backyard fence kind of thing. Maybe picket fence, I don't know. And, the fact of the matter is that the wall was always absurd. It was an absurd idea from the start. It is an absurd idea today. And it is and I agree with Donald Trump, right? It's impossible to do. He just won't acknowledge it. It's his actions and his approaches that are acknowledgments of it. I will actually say what he should say, that Donald Trump created a fantasy to deal with a real issue, immigration, and how we do fundamental immigration reform. And that fantasy, like the way that he has talked about DACA, like the way that he has done so many other things, is rooted in the fact, I believe, that he doesn't understand the issue itself. He doesn't understand the basics of it. I say this as a descendant of somebody who fought with Ethan Allen in the Revolutionary War, as a descendant of immigrants who came in the 1820s as economic immigrants out of Cornwall. I love the fact that I am of immigrant stock. And I love the fact that my people, my ancestors on the Ethan Allen side, he came illegally, snuck across the border. He was a French Canadian. He wanted to fight the British. So he snuck into the country to take on the government. My ancestor on the Cornish side came because the tin mines closed and he had to come to America because there was work here. He didn't come with big dreams except to make a living. The fact of the matter is, immigration is a wonderful, brilliant thing. We should organize it better, of course. But the fact is, I don't want walls. I don't want picking on DACA kids. I don't want this stupid, empty discussion that we have today. I want to say this country will benefit from a lot more immigration and a lot more good structures to make sure that those who do immigrate to this country can become fully a part of it and work really hard and pay for my Social Security. Thank you.
I think we would also say that today that Ethan Allen would have snuck over to try and paint that wall as well.
I hope everyone got that, because that was an incredible, quick on the feet joke.
Thank you very much. I think the fact that the president is not so serious about the wall was demonstrated when, in a remarkable concession, the Democrats agreed to $25 billion to go to the wall in exchange for DACA. And he turned his back on that deal. So that basically kind of tells you how the forces in the administration to have a restrictionist immigration policy beyond just about anything anybody has suggested over the last 20 or 30 years is what's influencing the president right now, and the wall is secondary.
As a footnote to all this, when I was last on the Hill, for all my sins, I always keep getting the immigration issue in my lap. And we had a lot of talks with the Homeland Security Committee, which had jurisdiction over some of these border issues. And the working document has always been on the Republican side, in the House at least, not a wall across the entire border. It's basically you divide the border into zones, and there are different ways to address the situation in each zone. In a couple of cases, you're talking about walls. In a lot of cases, you're talking about enhanced human patrols and drones and that sort of thing. You don't need a wall from the vast majority of that a few thousand miles of terrain. Just FYI, and I think John's correct that the campaign rhetoric was rhetoric and not meant to be taken literally.
I'm going to link a few questions together. The first is, or together, there's no first. Do you believe President Trump will be impeached? And then stretching to think the impeachment would actually move to a removal, would this country be better off with President Pence?
Actually, I would like to see the reaction of this room. Those of you who would, if it's Trump as is, let's put it this way. Those of you who would prefer President Pence right now.
I'll take President Pence. Yep. No, I'll take President Pence. Yep.
Okay. How many of you, with the possibility of Pence, how many of you would be willing to suffer through Trump for another couple of years, another few years?
There's a lot in the middle there, brother.
Okay. Just, to answer the question, I would say I think there's assuming that if the Democrats take over the House in November, I would say the chances of him being impeached are 15 to 20%. I think that's, and of course that's heavily dependent on what, if anything, Mueller comes forward with, and him being, and if they impeach within that 15 to 20%, it's basically 0 to 5% of him being removed.
Yeah, I think the Senate is the obstacle to removal, obviously, the threshold of the next first term at least. And I kind of agree with Robert's general assessment. I'd probably lower the first number even more so.
I love that we're talking about impeachment. We're on to the percentage figure. We're not, it's no longer, we're on to the structural stuff.
Well, John, I have to say,
we've already determined what you are, lady. We're just now determining the price.
This is my third panel, and I'm surprised that we've spent some time so far talking about things other than impeachment.
Yeah, it's true. Look, first off, I want to tell you, I love impeachment so much that about a decade ago, I wrote a history of impeachment entitled The Genius of Impeachment. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful tool. And because in this country, we revolted against a king, and I like the idea that a president is not a king for 4 years. You don't simply come into that office and get carte blanche to do whatever you want. And boy, if there's anybody who's teaching us about the problem of someone who does carte blanche, whatever they want, it's Donald Trump. And so the fact of the matter is we now have a lively discussion about impeachment in this country. I don't know where it's going to go. I'm not going to debate these guys on percentages here, because once we're debating percentages, I'm already pretty happy, right? You know, we're in the game, you know, and I don't know what the percentage is that the Green Bay Packers are taking the Super Bowl, but I'm glad that they're in the game. And so here's the bottom line, though. Impeachment is a wonderful tool. Do not let your Democratic or Republican politicians tell you that something that was put into the Constitution to check and balance elite power, executive power, irresponsibility, right? To say that no one in this country, not even a president, is above the law. That we should abandon that or never take it seriously. We should embrace that and say, yeah, that is an appropriate check and balance. And, you know, the other day, there's this new group called Republicans for the Rule of Law. And they just put a TV ad up, and it's a TV ad saying, don't fire Mueller, right? It's really not a good idea. I agree with them 100%. I think they're right on their ad. But I like the Republicans of the 1970s, like people like Weicker and Mathias and these folks who said, if the president is violating the law, he should be impeached and be removed from office. And I like the fact that a lot of them didn't say, oh, I don't know about Gerald Ford. Oh, I don't know about Agnew. You know, yeah, I know Mike Pence is, you know, maybe not somebody I'm inviting over to dinner. But the fact of the matter is, Mike Pence wasn't tweeting this morning at the Russians about shiny missiles sent into the Middle East. And so be realistic, people. We have a guy in the White House right now who's joking about mutually assured destruction. And so do not take impeachment.
Or worse, he wasn't joking.
Yeah, absolutely, comrade. Yes. So, ladies and gentlemen, please do not take impeachment off the table. It may be difficult, but it may also be necessary. And let us not be uncomfortable with it. Let us righteously go forward in the name of the Constitution and the American Republic. If indeed impeachment is necessary, let's go for it. And let's smile happily as we do it, because it's good for the country.
There's a slight caveat.
Don't take the fun out of the moment, my friend.
Well, if the reason why I said 15 to 20% is because I think that there is such there's a fervent energy amongst the Democratic base that there would be pressure on Democrats to many Democrats to go in that direction. Then the question is, though, will the broader public see that as a legitimate measure to check a president who's gone out of the scope of the rule of law, or is offensive to the rule of law, or will the broader public see it as a cheap political maneuver? Please keep in mind that the Republicans decided to impeach Bill Clinton in 1998, and it was one of the rare midterm elections where the party that controlled the White House ended up gaining seats because the broader electorate saw it as an unfair political attack and punished the Republicans for doing that. So now you may say that there are more than that Trump has looked. Well, I know what you're going to say. Oh, well, they impeached him because of Monica Lewinsky and things like that.
Yeah. Finish up the point. It's a good one. Go for that.
And that may all well be true, but make sure if you're going to go down the impeachment road, there's more than enough legitimate reasons to do it, and it's not just seen as a political ploy. That's all.
100% agree with him. Absolutely great point. 1998, not so good for the Republicans. They were actually, I mean, let's clear. It was clearly they were destroyed by advancing the issue. They were done politically forever because the next election they got the presidency and essentially, dominance in Congress. So with all due respect, this fantasy.
Actually, in 2000, the Democrats took back over the Senate.
They didn't lose the House, but they got the presidency. And the fact of the matter was that they were in a much stronger position than they'd been in before. And so this fantasy that impeachment's a third rail and you touch it and you're done for, boy, I'm a historian of the thing. With all due respect, it is not that. People actually like it when you stand for what you believe in. And here's one final thing, with all due respect. Some people may not like this. Robert, you have nothing to fear. I've been covering the Democratic Party for a long time. The notion that they would courageously and boldly go into something that was beyond their reach is way off the radar.
I cannot disagree with John there. What am I going to do?
If the Democrats advance impeachment, they will do so because they think it's a safe bet. And I wish they were more courageous, but boy, I can tell you, the one thing, if you're at a Democratic event and you bring up impeachment, watch the leadership run from the room. So the fact of the matter is, if we're serious about this, this goes into a balanced reality. We know this. We understand the dynamics. We understand the dynamics of politics. I am simply saying the core thing of this. Do not live in the fantasy that impeachment is a bad thing. Do not live in the fantasy that impeachment is, political third rail. These things are false. The fact of the matter is there are points at which we need to impeach, and there are points at which the people will reward you for holding wrongdoers, ill players, bad figures, bad actors to account. And a political party and political figures who do not do that feed the cynicism and the decay of the process. There are times when you must hold the most powerful man in the country to account. That restores a sense that no one is above the law.
We have a couple questions that really go into Donald Trump and his personality. Well, sort of mixing them together, sort of thoughts and perspective on the gung-ho, go-to-war personality that Donald Trump seems to have, and whether he's actually capable of sort of leading in a world environment with so much going on.
What I said earlier, I think, applies. I mean, the rhetoric is unpredictable and extreme, and it's also, it's part of a larger dynamic out there in the world too. There is a lot of Trumpian-type figures emerging around the world, in different, even in some Western European countries, right? So it just may be what's in the waters these days, and I don't like it. I think it hurts the sense of U.S. being a leading nation in the world, which I think is important.
Look, Donald Trump exposes the vulnerabilities of our American experiment, right? He proves something that we always said and kind of believed, but now we realize may not have been the wisest thing, is that anybody can become president. Because if indeed that was a reality, we could in fact have a president who was a pretty bad player. The weirdest thing is Donald Trump's not necessarily the worst player among our presidents. Andrew Jackson was a really, really, really bad guy. When the Supreme Court told him he had to be decent to Native Americans, he said, well, why did the Supreme Court send its army over, right? This is a guy who literally disregarded the rule of law at the most fundamental levels, beyond where Trump is at already. Now, it's notable that Donald Trump chose Andrew Jackson as his hero president. So be cautious. But the one thing that I really am hopeful about is that Donald Trump is a pampered son of privilege. He's a guy who grew up with wealth, he's been taken care of the whole way through. He's not a scrappy guy who fought for things. He's a guy who got a break at every turn. Even when he ran casinos into the ground, right, he got out of the bankruptcies. And then he appointed his bankruptcy lawyer, the ambassador to Israel, and now is the guy who helped to bail him out as the Secretary of Commerce. And so this is a weak and sad man. And that's my biggest hope, is that he is too weak, too self-absorbed to actually take steps that might end the world. Because he lives in it and he wants to take care of himself. And so his self-absorption, no, I'm not kidding about this. I think his self-absorption is our great hope at this point. And I hope that I haven't checked my phone in the last 10 seconds. So I hope that I'm right about that. But I also, and I say this very seriously, I think Donald Trump is teaching us about the vulnerabilities, about a lot of vulnerabilities, the Electoral College, cabinet governance as we currently have it, our failure of our media to cover presidential politics, a lot of things that he's proving. And we learn from things, I hope. And I hope that what we learn is this, that we should never, ever again choose as our president somebody who is a theatrical character, a reality TV star, who came to prominence just saying whatever came into his head. We should start, we, the people, and that's the media especially, we should start to take this thing a whole lot more seriously, because the fact of the matter is there's nothing about Donald Trump that is conservative. There's nothing about Donald Trump that is Republican. The crisis of the conservatives and the Republicans is they've gone along with him, right? They've left their principles, their values behind to march behind him. But there's nothing, this isn't what it is. Donald Trump is a deeply troubled, very dysfunctional person. He is the President of the United States. He brings his troubles and his dysfunctions out into open. Our primary role as citizens is to push back, but it is also to say, as many have before me, this isn't normal, and we should not accept this as normal, not merely for now, but for our future.
Donald Trump is unfortunately also a symptom of broader problems within our political system. I think in certain ways some of the voters voted for him because they felt that leading candidates in the two parties were corrupt in one way or another, and they felt that here's this guy, yeah, he's an entertainer, he's this, he's this, he's that, but they didn't necessarily want to vote for what they perceived as compromised other candidates, or frankly candidates that seemed to be representative of dynastic politics. And I mean, look, the Democratic field, the Democratic Party field in 2016 could have been a lot better. And instead, we ended up with Hillary Clinton. Many of you voted for her. I understand that. She was a problematic candidate in a number of ways. And when you ended up with two problematic candidates, both with historically high negatives, we ended up with what we got. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump. We're stuck with we're stuck with him. But voters in both parties need to do better in terms of the candidates that they select and demand quality.
Unless there's something really pressing that the panel wants to say, we'll conclude by saying that some of these guys have written some great books that are available at the Conference of World Affairs bookstore, which is powered by the Boulder bookstore. I don't know what powered by a bookstore means. The bookstore is located in the Mackey lobby. It's opened all week with books from the speakers. Join me in thanking our panelists for joining us here in Boulder County. Yeah, you bet. Thank you very much. You could run from there, Boulder.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. Hey, thank you, brother. Sister.